Hello everyone, welcome back to the Silver Screen Dudes YouTube channel. My name is Nico Liro, host here on the channel. And as a lot of you know, the channel is all about keeping cinema alive, the love of cinema, be it the big IPs, the blockbusters, the Christmas movies, the feel-goods, the independents, the art house, the documentaries, the whole shebang. The channel is about celebrating cinema. And I am very happy, honored, humbled to be joined today by a director, documentarian, writer, conceiver of one of my hidden gems of 2025, Reality Is Not Enough. Welcome to the channel, Paul Sng. Thank you.
Hey, Nico. Thanks for having me on.
It is, as I said, my great pleasure to talk to you today about a movie that really kind of caught me off guard. And I'd like to get straight into discussing that because Reality Is Not Enough. It's unlike any documentary I've seen before. It's a documentary, it's biographical, but it almost refuses to commit or confirm its own genre. It doesn't really chronicle the life of Irvine. It doesn't really take a stance or view on his life. It chooses to almost be a fly on the wall and capture a reflective moment in time. What was your reasoning to create the movie in this manner?
Well, thank you for those really kind words about the film. Initially, it was touching on a lot of what you said there, wanting to do something different, to not use talking heads, to not use some of the common devices that we use in documentary. And what you said there about, reflecting a moment in time, that was, I think, really where we found our rhythm with it. The original plan was to follow Irving for about 18 months. And, in observational filmmaking, you film what happens. But with somebody like Irving, who is very well known, it's quite hard to kind of, show the real side of his life because, obviously most of the time, like all of us, he does the things that human beings do. He's not, always going to be at film premieres or events, that sort of stuff. So we need to find a way into his life that would allow him to talk about, where he's been, because he's not somebody that is nostalgic. There was a quote that was in the head of me and our editor, Angela, at the beginning of the project. And it's a quote by Soren Kierkegaard. And I think a lot of people listening will know this quote because it's very well known. And the quote is, "Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards." And when I first started chatting to Irvin about the documentary, I remembered that quote. And I mean, even at one point, the film opened with that quote, but then I started to think, you can't open a film about a writer with another writer's work. It just felt a bit wrong. But when we knew Irvin was going to Toronto, we were in touch with a guy called Charlie over there who was going to work on the putting together a production team for us over there. And I was chatting to Charlie a bit about what he was doing as a filmmaker. And he was making a film about hallucinogenic drugs, some of which in Canada are illegal to take under supervision. So when he mentioned that, my ears pricked up because I thought, I know somebody who's quite fond of hallucinogenic drugs. And I wonder if I can persuade him to take them on camera and then use that as a device to explore, his subconscious, his what's in here, rather than what he necessarily is always like maybe telling us or showing us. And Irving was really up for it. He's a very generous collaborator. He agreed to it immediately. And then the trick was trying to find a way to represent the trip, because it's impossible to truly represent someone else's trip because you're not in their head. So I ran a few ideas past him, and he was really into the first idea, which was that we would film him, in an old warehouse in the dark, wandering around in a white suit while we hear, several master interviews, which we did over a period of time. And we see reflections, and we hear reflections, and we see projections of archive. One of the walls has footage of the times that he lived through. So we see political events, we see rave culture, we see the council estate where he grew up. And then on another wall, we see clips from his films. And then on the third wall, we see footage from the films. He's literally walking through his life. So, yeah, I mean, I knew that we had to make something that was bold and original, because that's Irving. He's a bold and original writer. And it was really good to hear, your intro to the film, because, I was thinking, great, Nico gets it, job done.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I'd like to think I got it because I mean, it really was. As I said, man, it caught me off guard. You know,
Mm.
you very much always go into a documentary. I mean, I love documentaries personally, but you always go into them with a, okay, cool. We're not going beyond reality. We're very much rooted in reality. Most of the time, there's a kind of traditional structure, you beginning, middle, and end. And you just broke that convention. And I love it when filmmakers do that. But I want to circle back to something you were just talking about. Could you share what your initial interactions with Irvine were like? Like, what you mentioned your pitch to him. You mentioned a few pitches. Talk to me about that pitch and how he responded to kind of being approached like that.
Yeah, we were already friends, so we knew one another, and we had a level of trust that comes between two friends. And we'd gone to see Todd Haynes' wonderful Velvet Underground documentary one Sunday,
Mhm.
and both really loved it. And during the film, I was thinking, I wonder why no one's made a documentary about Irvine. So I mean, afterwards, I popped the question, and yeah, obviously I was fishing around to see if he'd be interested, and he was. And then we initially just spoke about, what kind of film, what do we want to do and what don't we want to do. And I think they're both really important things, because if what you'd like to do, that's great. But knowing what you don't want to do and what the participant doesn't want to do, I think is equally important, because then you don't get down the line and have a false expectation. So initially, the first bit of filming was in Miami, which is where Irvine lives for some of the year, and it was just in that early bit. I mean, you know what it's like when you make a film, particularly a documentary. Most of it doesn't make it into the final cut.
Mm.
And I think pretty much all of the stuff we shot in Miami. I mean, a couple of little bits made it in terms of in the pre-title, but I don't think there's anything else. And it was good stuff. It wasn't that it was not interesting, because we had to make a lot of cuts. We cut Bret Easton Ellis, we cut Arthur Baker, and we cut some of Irvine's close collaborators and dear friends, not because they weren't interesting or the scenes weren't funny. It was because they were either double beats and we had it with someone else, or they weren't advancing the narrative in the way that we were looking for. But yeah, I think those early initial interactions were maybe getting a sense of what he was going to be like on camera. He's a natural. He's a great storyteller, both in writing and I think in terms of speaking about stories. Actually, one thing from Miami did make it into the film. The boxing gym stuff, that was
Yeah, that
that
was
made.
cool. That was really cool. And I think it kind of painted without emphasizing the point, and I go back to what I said at the top, you very much chose to not take a stance and just show, as opposed to having either a political or ideological stance with it, which I loved.
Thank you.
But even with the boxing, it was like, okay, so you're clearly showing that this is a man who's done drugs, who clearly still does drugs to some degree, and that dopamine hit, that adrenaline hit that you get from boxing. This is, he's traded a bad addiction for a different type of dopamine hit. So, I mean, I'm a Thai boxing coach myself as a pastime. So, I mean, I've seen that type of interaction that Irvine has with the gym, where he's going in and he's basically getting his hit. He's getting his hit of dopamine to keep him on the straight and narrow. And I thought the fact that you showed that without ever sort of ringing the bells and being like, look, 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 I was like,
Mm,
chapeau, nice one.
thank you.
But so I want to talk this next question, in light of what you just said, actually is going to fascinate me how you answer this, because you mentioned that you two were already friends,
Mm.
but there's little to no interaction. I mean, basically no interaction between you, the documentarian, the filmmaker, and your subject, Irvine. You just kind of let him be. Can you discuss the collaborative process between you and Irvine, and how did you manage to achieve your movie with this approach?
Yeah, I mean, all of the interactions are off camera. I'm not somebody as a filmmaker that puts myself in the film in that way. I mean, as directors, every film that I think we make, there's elements of us in it, whether it's in the narrative, whether it's in the themes, whether it's something that biographically chimes with something in your own life. But you know, I had no desire or interest to be, heard in the film. So it was more a case of, research is everything. So one of the first things I did was reread, a lot of Irvine's books, not all of them, but certainly about 10 of them. And I was looking for quotes that tied into certain themes. I mean, very early on, I wrote down, I think, about 6 themes that I thought the film would explore. So mortality, creativity, drugs and hedonism, love, place and belonging, and I suppose existence. What does it mean to be a human being? And once I had those kind of themes in mind, reading through his work, what I was looking for were quotes from the books that explored those subjects. And it was, I wouldn't say it was easy, as in like an easy process, because, you're kind of going through all of this stuff, and to narrow down to effectively what were 10 quotes that appear in the film was hard. But it was a great source of material to find this stuff. And things were then kind of built thematically. It wasn't a linear story of, Irvine was born here and then he did this, this, and this. It was more a case of, what can we look at thematically? Where can we go from, talking about Irvine's origins, in terms of where the place that he is from, and then bringing that in at the end, where does it belong? So kind of going back to these things, and how does creativity tie into his hedonism and his sense of mortality and all of this sort of stuff. So that was, the body of the research. And then in terms of speaking to Irvine, I guess we would have spoken a bit about the process, which was how I generally like to work is, have a sense of what the scene is. I mean, sometimes what you want to get out of a scene, sometimes you don't. And an example of that would be when Irvine meets up with Colin and Dougie, his 2 oldest friends. I knew that I needed that anecdote where they talk about being arrested when they were 7 years old, because that is, in that particular, section of the film, that's the inciting incident that is responsible for Irvine's distrust of authority, and I think sends him down on a path towards where he is this kind of anti-authoritarian figure. And so, in a scene like that, we would talk about, okay, can you mention this? And getting them, I like to get people to do things, so getting them to play football first relaxes them a bit. Then you get them, in the bar afterwards, and I just let people go. If you let people go and you don't interrupt, you often get good stuff. I mean, the only time I really interrupt in these sort of moments is if there's a technical problem or if somebody's in danger. And by that, I mean, if somebody's emotionally distressed, I would usually stop. I know for some people that makes great cinema, and it does, but personally, I like people to feel safe.
Yeah, it can also be quite exploitative doing it that way.
Yeah, and I've always kind of resisted that. But most of the prep was kind of, done in having an understanding of what the themes would be, and then being able to pick people for him to meet and chat to that would bring that stuff out. I mean, for Debbie Donovan in Hackney Museum, we knew they'd talk about politics because, I'd met Debbie before. I know Debbie's, history as an activist, as a campaigner. So it was, I mean, most of the time things would come out that, we weren't expecting, which was great. But it's all about thinking about, right, this person is here because they're going to talk about this. And then you just kind of let them go. And if you film for however long, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, if you feel that you haven't got something, what I do at the end is I give them a period where, I can maybe ask them actually to talk about something specific that maybe we haven't covered.
It's interesting. It kind of speaks volumes to the fact that you're kind of using the tools at your disposal then, because, you're talking about how you knew Debbie. I imagine with Irvine's friends, there was an element of, okay, I need you to say X, Y, Z. So it's actually adds another layer of intrigue to how you made this film. It's like, cool, I got these tools. How can I get the most out of them? It's really interesting. And speaking of tools, actually, I thought, I mean, you can see the background image if you're watching on YouTube now, as opposed to listening on pod. This is one of his scenes in the warehouse you mentioned, where he's all dressed in white. And I thought the cinematography in this was fantastic, considering that you went for a fly on the wall approach. And I thought the editing was also incredibly well executed. you managed to convey what it's like almost being, as you said, inside the psyche of Irvine Welsh while he was under the influence of DMT and running through pivotal moments of his life. How did, from a cinematography point of view and from an editing point of view, how did you achieve that effect? What was the planning involved?
So in the warehouse, in advance of that, we'd spoken to a guy called Stephen who runs a projections business, and I'd met Stephen once before. I'd seen the kind of stuff that he'd done at events and knew that he was, really good at his job. So it was a case then of thinking about what is going to go on these walls. And so we worked with Amanda, who was, put the kind of archive stuff for us together. Knew that we needed clips from the films. Obviously, there were so many iconic scenes in Trainspotting that we had our pick of those. And then we hadn't shot all of the film. How much of the film had we shot? We'd shot quite a bit of it. So we picked out some of the actuality scenes that we knew were going to make it into, or we thought were going to make it into the final film. And then it was a case of just, chatting to Spike, who was our cinematographer for that section of the film, and just shooting as much as possible. I mean, when we were in the edit, Angela, who was our brilliant editor, did really well to kind of, because we were in the memory space for quite a lot of time to actually find shots that, looked different, because a lot of it is quite similar because it's one location. Obviously the backgrounds can change, the projections are different, but effectively a man walking through things in a white suit, you're limited in terms of the scope. So it was a case of thinking about, not always wanting to sort of directly, have to show and tell at the same time, because obviously the real interest is in Irvine's words. And I think some of the time, we were keen to sort of put people in his head, and some of that footage is quite abstract. One of my notes to the cinematographer was, this shouldn't look polished. If it looks too polished, then the audience, I don't think, will accept it as being, Irvine, because Irvine is somebody that it isn't polished. He's somebody that's quite raw. So it needed to be handheld. It needed to be shot, I think, in a way that was, I suppose, has that sort of frenetic energy to it, and particularly with the editing style as well. I mean, Angela and I, from the very beginning, had a structure. We knew what our inciting incident was, which was the DMT trip. We knew that, our midpoint was going to be a point where Irvine is questioned by the podcast guy in Ireland. And yeah, I mean, I'm very proud of the structure and the work that we did on that, because the cut did go through a number of changes to, as they always do, to arrive at the final version.
Yeah, that I have to say that maybe that was the intention. I did find that Irish podcast I felt like he was angling to try and get Irvine angry, and Irvine handled it really well. But I was like, man, come on. Can you ask questions about his work as opposed to whether he thinks freaking heroin's good or not? Like, give the guy a break, man. He was, purposefully provocative, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that was we were very late for that interview. We'd been filming in a pub and we'd been filming with some of Irvine's friends, and they stayed in the pub longer than planned. And by the time we got to that interview, we were probably, I think we were a couple of hours late, and Michael was understandably a bit irked with us. And the interview was a bit like a boxing match. I mean, it was a very small studio and I had to watch it on the monitor, and I couldn't, communicate with Robbie, the DOP, while we were filming. But I remember watching it on the monitor and just thinking, this is gold. This is really, this is the sort of stuff you can't necessarily prepare for. It wasn't a deliberate ploy to be late and wind up Michael. It was just one of those things that happens.
Yeah, and it made for a great scene. So the movie as a whole, did you feel the weight of this project? Because we're talking about one of the most celebrated British authors of recent memory, and also one who's unapologetically controversial and really doesn't seem to care what he says and stands by his convictions. How did you manage the weight of expectation for that as a filmmaker?
Well, it's a good question. I suppose, having that sense of responsibility to somebody whose work I'd read, 30 years ago, was in some ways, motivating, because you go into anything, you want to do your best work, but when you're, working with one of the, the greatest writers of modern times, you know that you really have to up your game. And so I suppose it was a case of, and this is something that producers do, because working on the film with people like a producer called Natasha Dack, who worked on the film in the early stages with us, gave really good notes, but very challenging notes, saying, almost like saying, you got to do better than this. You need to sort of, it needs to be something beyond just observational footage and novel readings. It needs something else. And having notes like that from Natasha were an early kind of, I suppose, a kick up the arse, because, directors never really like rough cuts or their first cut. You look at it and you think, I can do better. But I think sometimes, you can get to your third or your fourth rough cut and start to feel a bit pleased with yourself. And I think on this one, I certainly was in that place where I was thinking, oh, this is pretty good. But then having some harsh notes from a few people I showed the film to really helped kind of motivate me. I mean, I think any artistic endeavor involves a lot of confidence. And if you don't have confidence in what you do, the work can suffer. And I think there were moments where, people were very blunt with some of their notes, and I think it was useful because it gives you, I suppose, it's a challenge. It's like somebody saying, no, you can do better. And so having others look at things and say it's good but it could be great was a real motivator for me.
I love that. So there are certain scenes in this movie, such as Irvine taking the DMT. You didn't shy away from that happening, and certain things like the one that struck me is when he refused the need for anybody to do therapy on the basis that it's essentially handing power over to someone else. These are quite taboo subjects for many. How are you hoping your audiences react to these?
I mean, I think when you see a really thought-provoking film, what we might call a great film, for instance, you come away with more questions. Whenever I go to the cinema, and I go to the cinema once, twice a week at least, I like to come out and I like to have questions, and I like to, little things like, if I've seen something in the film that I don't fully understand, I'll Google it, or even, going on IMDb and reading through the trivia. I love all that about a great film, that it continues. It doesn't just end. I mean, films I don't enjoy that much, they're in and they're out of your conscience, but really great films, I'm asking questions afterwards. And I think for this one, when Irvine said that, I disagreed with it. And interestingly, I actually started therapy myself last August, and I'm still doing it. And it's been hugely useful. And I always respect Irvine's opinions, and I respect his forthrightness. I mean, Irvine and I don't think we've ever had an argument. And certainly if I disagreed with him on something and he disagreed with me, we might talk about it, but we wouldn't fall out, because it's a very binary world. And I think we've lost a lot of our ability to kind of accept other people's differences and opinions. And certain things, I think, are things we can all agree on, and you can't have any kind of gray area. But I think around the big hot topics of debate in the world, there's more nuance than we think. And so with something like Irvine's comments about therapy, I disagreed. And but I also knew that I used to have that view. I used to think that therapy was something that, if it was a weakness to go to it. And I changed my mind. I don't know whether it was before Irvine said that, or a bit before. It might have been earlier than that. But it did make me really think, well, an audience is going to watch this, and half of the people might think, that's rubbish. I'm doing therapy. It's been good for me. And then there might be people that think that they agree with him. And I think it's important that, those kind of views are heard. I didn't want to paint a picture of Irvine that was one-sided. He has his flaws, and he talks about his demons. We never set out to make a hagiography. It was always going to be a rounded portrait.
Yeah. And that, I think, is part of the success of the film. As I said, it's the fact that you managed to capture the fact that he was let's try and rephrase that one, that you managed to capture how unapologetically honest he is about how he feels about the world, but you did so while not demonizing him, which comes back to what I said at the top. You didn't take a stance on this. You know, I know a lot of filmmakers would hear, gotcha, soundbite, taking that demonization time
Yeah.
and almost throw him under the bus. I mean, obviously, the fact that you're mates helps, but it was really refreshing to see, like, because the words do enough, because I've been through my therapy, and the words do enough to make you go, whoa. And then you
Mm.
think, hang on, this is a guy who was borderline assaulted as a 7-year-old. He's a product of his environment. Like, his worldview has been shaped by forces outside of his control. Let me give him this space and time to articulate what he's saying. And it was really cool that that was how you made the movie, as I keep saying. And speaking of movies, then, what are some, you know, cinephile that you are, cinema twice a week, love that, long love cinema. What are some movies that have deeply influenced you, both in the making of this movie
Mm.
specifically and as a filmmaker in general?
I mean, in terms of this movie, you know, when you're going to make a film about a writer, um, I mean, there aren't too many documentaries about writers, but there were two that I watched to kind of get a sense of how to do it well. And one was a film about Edna O'Brien, the Irish writer, that came out, I think, last year. It's absolutely brilliant. I also watched a film called The Pigeon Tunnel, which is about John le Carre. And I'm not a fan of John le Carre's novels. I didn't really, you know any. I mean, I've seen a couple of the TV adaptations, like, you know, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and the film version as well.
Mm.
But the way that those films, you know, presented a writer was impressive. And I suppose it wasn't like a direct influence, but it did make me think this can be done. Um, Going back to, you know, the documentarians that I've, you know, have kind of watched over the last 20 odd years. I mean, Asif Kapadia is a massive influence. What he has done with the form in terms of, you know, using voices and archive rather than, you know, talking heads and showing people was a big influence. Not only not really necessarily on this film, but just on my practice in general. The What was it? The third film I made about polystyrene, that was really influenced by Asif's work. Um, in terms of sort of more general filmmakers, I mean, it's the usual suspects really. Wong Kar-wai, you know, In the Mood for Love. There's a reference to that in Reality Is Not Enough. Probably several references where Irvine walks across the frame and his shadow. There's a scene in The Mood for Love that, you know, we kind of pay a kind of subtle homage to.
Nice.
Andrea Arnold and Lynn Ramsey, love their work. Ken Loach, Mike Leigh, um, Patrick Keeler, you know, who
Mm.
made the Robinson trilogy. London is one of my absolute favorite films of all time. You know, it's not a documentary, it's not a drama, it's an essay film. That's always on my mind, that film. And Julian Temple, The Filth and the Fury, that kind of Irvine, you know, Irvine's an old punk, so that film was, you know, is always on my mind whenever I'm thinking about anything to do with that period. You know, he made the definitive punk documentary. Nobody's, I think, ever going to make a better punk film than The Filth and the Fury because Julian's done it.
Nice. So to finish off then, a question I ask everyone who I interview. Can you share some hidden gems that you believe are absolute must-sees, that you believe a lot of mainstream audiences might have missed or not be aware of?
Well, London by Patrick Keeler would be the first one. I mean, for those of you that don't know what that film is about, it takes an unseen narrator and his best friend Robinson, who we never see in the film, and it's a series of static frames of London as these two guys, who are both flaneurs, are wandering. And you know, the camera's always static, and you just see images of London in the run up to the 1992 election. And you know, the narrator Paul Scofield talks about his friend Robinson and what he thinks and what he says, and they basically trace the kind of psychogeography of London going back to, you know, the French poets like Rimbaud and Baudelaire and Verlaine, but managed to link that to what's going on in the present day and how neoliberal politics have become so prominent. It's one of those things. I think it's a Marmite film. I think people that watch it, they tend to either fall in love with it or just don't get it. So that would certainly be one of them. And then I'd probably pick a film that's, I think, on release this week. It's called Put Your Soul on Your Hands and Walk. It's a documentary by an Iranian filmmaker who's in exile when the film's being made, and she's having these intimate mobile phone conversations with a young 24-year-old woman in Gaza who is under the threat of a bombardment by the IDF, and it's a beautiful film. It's as personal as you can get, and it's just a series of phone calls and then footage of the news and what's happening. It's all shot on a phone. That's really good. I'd also pick a film called Mortician. I can't remember the director's name, but I saw it recently at the Edinburgh International Film Festival. It's a film about somebody, an Iranian who's living in Canada, and he's somebody that washes bodies when they die, and he's asked to by this famous singer who's also living in exile to wash her body because she wants to kill herself. And it's a great film. The filmmaker it's one of those films that was made by the director without a crew, and when you watch it and you realize, it has the best end credit sequence I've ever seen. I won't tell anything more about it, but any filmmaker that watches that end credit scene will go away feeling inspired and impressed, really.
And it's called
Mortician,
right? Those are some movies I'm going to have to add to my collection then. So, Paul, what projects can we expect from you next? What's on the horizon for Paul Sng?
Well, the next one's a film called Little Warrior, and it's about a Venezuelan boxer who's trying to escape poverty in Venezuela, where she lives, and qualify for the Olympics. So I suppose it's one of those stories. It's boxing is the MacGuffin in the film. It's really about Joanna as a person and her character. She's one of the most charismatic people I've ever met. So we've pretty much shot all of it. We just need to film an ending in Venezuela, and hoping to go into the edit on it early next year and have it out next year at some point.
Fantastic. So a nice thing for us Paul Sng fans to look forward to then. Paul, thank you again for joining me today here on the Silver Screen Dudes. It's been a pleasure, honest pleasure to talk to you for the last 30 minutes. And thank you for giving the world such a great movie on such a celebrated author. If people want to follow you online, where can they do so?
On Instagram at Paul Sng 1.
Paul Sng 1. Thank you so much, Paul. Guys, from me, I know sadly not enough of you give documentaries the time of day amongst the flurry of bombast IPs that have, well, some have been good, that have hit the screen this summer and throughout the course of the year. But I reiterate this every single time I have a filmmaker on the channel. Please look beyond your Cineplexes and the big mainstream releases and really have a deep dive at some of the amazing creative work from filmmakers like Paul Sng are doing for the industry. This soundbite of all cinema is now just sequels, remakes, and reboots couldn't be further from the truth. At no time in history has more original cinema been made than right now, and reality is not enough as testament to that. So for me, Nico Lira here on the Silver Screen Dudes, long love cinema. I will see you all very soon. Yeah, let me know now down in the comments what you're going to be seeing this week, and long love cinema, guys. Bye for now.